Hello and welcome to another Stellarian Games video. In this episode, we're going to be looking at something a little bit different. Normally I focus on making game terrain or gaming accessories that go along with the tabletop in a way that you can use miniatures and place them around the tabletop and interact with those items. Today's episode, we're going to be looking at a much smaller scale, a diorama scale of a valley fortress. This diorama is still, I used it as part of a gaming session to give the players a lot more detail, a lot larger area to focus on, but obviously it's far too small to put miniatures on other than in a kind of abstract way. The stairs and everything aren't big enough for the miniatures to play on, but this is meant to be a larger scale so you could see kind of the whole without having to describe here's this, here's that, here's that. Here's a whole valley fortress, and you can kind of see all the ins and outs of what's happening. Obviously, you don't see up and down the valley. It's a limited scale to that degree, but it was a really nice scale to allow the players to look at this building as a whole without having a gigantic structure in a miniature sense. This is a much smaller scale. It was very easy to just plop on the table and have them look at it, but detailed enough where they could look at it and go, I think we should do this. I think we should do that. And it gave them lots of tactical options and opportunities, which they exploited very well in the session. So let's go to the table and see how this one is done.
Okay, for this project, we're going to start with some 3/4 inch XPS foam. And we're measuring this 11 by 17, I believe is the measurement of this. And I chose this particular dimension so that it would fit into a normal paper ream box for storage purposes. I'm cutting out just some kind of random shapes, but this will be the valley walls of the canyon. And I'm going to just start measuring a bunch of these layers into a stack to form the height of all of the different walls. I'm using some different heights, using 3/4 inch, 1 inch, 2 inch in a bunch of different settings. Now on the hot wire cutter, I'm cutting out the actual building. I wanted these to have a nice smooth cut to them, so that's why I'm doing these on the hot wire rather than just knifing them freehand. Back over to the table, I'm tracing that layer so that I can start building up the next layers, and it'll just be kind of stacking layer on top of layer. So here I'm cutting the rock walls with the knife, and then I'm going to just kind of cut next to the building but go back over to the hot wire cutter. Using the hot wire to actually cut the building itself, so that way it gets that nice smooth finish. Tracing this onto some thicker 2-inch XPS foam, and on the hot wire cutter, just because it's easier to cut this thick XPS on the hot wire cutter, I'm just going and cutting that shape out. This would be really annoying at the 2-inch thickness to do this with a knife. Then cutting out another layer of that building. And starting to stack, and now starting to add some texture to all of those cuts. So I'm using a knife and some sculpting tools to start tearing away at the rock. The stacks right now are fairly smooth and stacked next to each other, but using these carving tools, I can just kind of tear away at that rock and make it look more organically rough, like a real rock wall would. And again, this whole thing I'm just kind of doing in layers and keeping the layers free just so that I can work in a couple different dimensions without worrying about being able to reach down into the canyon. So that's why I'm not gluing this all together quite yet. But I wanted these rock walls to have kind of a corresponding texture, which is why I'm holding it down and then doing this carving so that it'll fit together in the end, but it is not yet glued together. So I'm using the knife to kind of cut down in and then tear away at those chunks, and that gives this nice relief rock structure on the walls. I'm tracing it onto a bottom layer. This will be the actual layer for the ground underneath. So I'm cutting out at an angle to form kind of a riverbed. This will be the bottom layer. And as you can see, I've done a little bit of cutting out for the cave entrances so that it has some depth as you look into them, but they only go so far. But I wanted to make sure that those were painted black before I glued everything together. Now I'm starting to work on some of the buildings for this, the archways and buildings, using circle tracing tool and just starting to cut out some small pieces to form all of these buildings and add some small detail work. Here's the exterior stairway, just adding in those tiny little stair cuts. And more for the buildings, just tracing out what I think are the right shapes, adding some circles and arches, and then just cutting in with an X-Acto knife and then doing a little bit of a relief cut so that it has a little bit of an indent. I'm going to cut out a top railing for this building, just cutting in with the X-Acto knife, and I'll take that over to the hot wire cutter, just remove a layer, and then I'll glue that back down layer. All right, here's all the different pieces that I have managed to cut out, and now I'm just gluing those into the right stacks of buildings. Gluing that railing layer on for the upper building. And then this is the temple side of the valley, just gluing on that outer face. And then the upper portion of that building as well. This is kind of the top of the mansion building. And then the top of the shrine. And this is just a small Reaper figurine that I glued to the top as a statue. Now I'm going to start the gluing of the actual stack of cave walls. This is that first layer under the building, just using hot glue to glue that into place, and then gluing the front part of that on. That forms the kind of the hidden cave behind the building. Now I'm using some of the spare cutoff chunks and forming some small boulders. These will be used to glue down into the valley floor and form some different elements in that valley floor. So you can see I glued some of those flat boulders into place, and then a lot of those other boulders will get added later on. The white material is a coarse molding paste. This is an art supply that has a nice coarse grainy texture to it, and I like using this to form kind of sand bases on figures that I use, but for this application it's perfect to add kind of that sandy desert feel to the base of this canyon. Once that's dry, I'm using some white glue and gluing a bunch of these boulders into place. to add a lot of rubble to strewn about, as well as at the base of the eventual waterfall. Now starting to glue on more of the layers, adding in the stairs and archways, making sure all of that's in place as I'm stacking it up. One more layer of the building. And then the thicker sides of the canyon walls on that side. Now I'm going to coat the entire piece in the black paint and Mod Podge. That will give it a nice sturdy, rugged coat. That'll be perfect for applying paint later on. Now the painting, I'm starting with a dark brown and using a pretty heavy dry brush over all of this. This gives it that nice dark earthy tone as the basis to start adding other colors and layers. Using this brown also for the buildings to give them the same tone. Now I'm using a raw sienna. I like this kind of golden color. The stone could have been painted more in like a sandstone color, but for the theme of what I was trying to get at, I wanted it to have a little bit more of an igneous feel, at least for the stone canyon walls. So that's why I'm going with this raw sienna that gives it kind of a rusty color, and then adding a little bit of gray over the top really makes it look like a good igneous stone. Then I'm coming in on all of the buildings and using more of a khaki tan. I figured the buildings would be made out of more of a sandstone or a limestone, which would just be easier to work in. I'm also adding that to the floor of the canyon. That'll give it kind of that sandy feel to the canyon floor as well. I'm adding another layer of a little bit lighter white, not quite a pure white, but a kind of a creamy white, just to bring out that sort of limestone feel to all of these buildings, get them out of that tan range. Doing a dry brush over those buildings, and you can see it's not a full dry brush over everything, it's a little bit patchy. It gives it kind of an aged, weathered feel to it. Then gluing those buildings into place. First the shrine, and then the mansion building. And lastly, the temple building on the other side of the valley. I'm gluing it a little bit of hot glue. This is a hot glue piece that I had glued onto some wax paper and let that cool, and then pulled it off and glued it into place so that it would form the waterfall. Just using some hot glue to form that into place, and then using some clear acrylic caulk to form the upper portion of that waterfall. This will dry perfectly clear, and it'll have that water effect. I'm also adding that to the river at the bottom to form the water rushing through that little gully. Then I'm starting to add a little bit of white glue in, painting that around to add some flocking in. This will be some green, at least around the water source here in the valley. Everything else looks very parched and dry, but at least where that water is, there'll be a little bit of green. Once that's dry, I'm adding some just dots of the white glue and adding some dark flocking as well to add small little bushes. And there is the final product. This one was a really fun project to set the tone of kind of a whole map while being small, storable, and it was really kind of a fun thing to play with, allowing the players to really look around and see what they could use to their advantage. Lots of interesting little pieces to this that gives it a nice flavor to really set the tone. So I hope you like this piece. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you.